Welcome. As the Executive Director of the Learning Disabilities Association of Windsor-Essex County, I welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. We are excited about our webinar, Transition to Post-Secondary. This webinar aims to educate students and their guardians on developing a transition plan for post-secondary education, also to provide information on navigating accessibility and disability services during their post-secondary education. This webinar will be recorded. Some housekeeping issues. Keep your cameras off as the session is being recorded. Keep yourself muted unless speaking, engaging in conversation to reduce background noise. And when you want to contribute or have a question, use the chat feature. Questions from the chat will be addressed in the question period. Next slide. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Michaela Delgaides from the Resiliency Project will share her experience transitioning and navigating through post-secondary. A Master of Education candidate, doctoral applicant, philanthropic leader, community activist, and pageant competitor, Michaela is a proud disabled Indigenous woman whose personal experiences empowers her to use her voice to promote positivity to people in marginalized communities through her community collective, the Real Resiliency Project, an organization which supports marginalized communities to discover their resiliency through respect, empower, action, and lifestyle. Dedicating hundreds of hours each year to the betterment of those impacted by societal oppression, Michaela takes this mission into her career as a student success advisor. Next, we have Dr. Mark Cronwell. Dr. Mark Cronwell is a registered child and adolescent psychologist in the areas of clinical and school psychology. Dr. Cronwell received his PhD from Wayne State University in the Child and Adolescent School Psychology program. Dr. Cronwell is an adjunct faculty member in the school psychology program at Wayne State University, teaching classes in psychological assessment. At this time, Dr. Cronwell is the supervisor of the psychological services and speech and language departments at the Greater Essex County District School Board. Nick Simonito is a former client of the Learning Disabilities Association of Windsor-Essex County. He has benefited from the LDA's many programs, including the AT training program, which assisted him in better understanding his learning disability and mastering the use of assistive technology. Nick has worked and volunteered for the association, serving in roles including summer camp counselor, after-school tutor, and in the ABC 123 program. Nick has been on the board of directors for 6 years and is the vice president. Nick is a St. Clair College Developmental Services Worker Program graduate and works at the Greater Essex County District School Board. Finally, Anthony Gomez has worked as an accessibility advisor and assistive technologist with the University of Windsor for over 2 decades. In this capacity, he primarily supports students with ADHD and learning disabilities diagnoses, ensuring they can access appropriate academic accommodations. Through his involvement with the Inter-University Disability Issues Association and various provincial and local organizations, Anthony has built a career as an advocate for students with disabilities. He believes in the potential of technology as an equalizer in the learning process. Anthony is a board member of the Learning Disabilities Association of Windsor-Essex County. We ask that you hold questions until the end of the presentations. After the presentations, we will have time for these questions and provide answers. After this webinar, you will receive a copy of the presentation slides, a copy of the transition to post-secondary checklist, and a link for where you can access this recorded webinar. Next slide. I'd like to welcome Michaela.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Marianne and the LDAWE. My name is Michaela Delgaides, and I'm talking about the perspective of a student who's been there. I am currently the founder and executive director of the Real Resiliency Project, and as for my bio, I'm also a student success advisor at Mohawk College, so I specialize in supporting students with disabilities, ranging from workplace accidents to those within the Career Pathways program and the Cooperative Education program as well. Next slide. So a little bit about me that a lot of people might not readily see when they meet me is I have multiple forms of disabilities. I got my first diagnosis when I was about 8 years old, but we knew when I was a very young age that I did have a series of disabilities, but did have the formal process at 8. So to kind of go over a little bit about what I have ranging from developmental to learning disabilities and also mental health as well. So the ones that really impact me the most are kind of listed on these slide. So I do have learning disabilities. So the most significant one is I have dyscalculia. And for those who don't know, dyscalculia is learning disability that is specific to mathematics. So really understanding kind of how math works, understanding numbers. So if you need to do basic equations, please do not reach out to me because 9 times out of 10, I won't be able to do them. I have a very hard time kind of understanding the process of equations and memorizing them. So I have found in both college and university, I've needed significant accommodations geared towards accommodating this form of disability. I grew up with a communication disability, so I was selective mute for a majority of my life and always felt that my voice was not as important as my peers. So that's why I was diagnosed with a communication learning disability. And another one is I have a mild specific learning disability in science. So again, it's pretty much linked to a dyscalculia as well, is I just have a very hard time understanding broader concepts in math and science. Another one is auditory processing disorders. So I have a really hard time kind of taking my own notes. So I have found in the college and in university, I've had to utilize a number of different accommodations to help me in this process. So from note taker to getting someone to scribe for me, to having kind of accommodations that accessible learning was not really well equipped for. So I've had to really kind of just develop my own sense of accommodations surrounding this one as well. I also have a sensory processing disorder. So this one kind of affects my 5 senses. So oftentimes I get scared really easily. I don't like to be touched all too often. Also, I get very overwhelmed with any kind of external stimuli. So I find during my tests in particular, I do have to utilize the testing centers on campus. That way I can be in a very safe and secure location. I also struggle with mental health. So I have anxiety, I have depression, I have what's called borderline personality disorder. So I kind of think in very black and white thinking rather than kind of like a scale. So I can go from 0 to 100 really, really fast. I also have what's called obsessive compulsive disorder. So I have time associated OCD. And next slide. So I've kind of, throughout my educational experience, I have had a wide range of post-secondary experience. Now, I never actually knew that I was going to achieve this much education. If you would have asked me at 8 years old, my ambition was to be a princess. I had a whole theory that I was going to move to England and marry a prince, and that was going to be the extent to my career goals. But as I have gone through various forms of my education, I have been able to surpass my own expectations. So in elementary school, I really struggled with all aspects of academics. So I really struggled to, again, communicate, really struggled with reading and writing, and really could not grasp a lot of the concepts. So I did unfortunately fail grade 8. So going into high school, I already knew that I was going to struggle, but I knew that I needed to become my own advocate. So because I have a mother who was a teen mom at the time, it was oftentimes really, really difficult for us to navigate kind of the system of having accommodations and kind of the resources we needed. So throughout my education, I've really had to be my own advocate and really kind of navigate the system myself. So in high school, something shifted where I was like, I wanted to prove to people that despite having disabilities, I was able to excel in education. So I ended up doing very well in high school and getting a number of different scholarships. Now, I decided on a whim that I wanted to help people and I wanted to try college out, even though They told me that I probably wouldn't excel in college just because of the nature of some of my disabilities. So I tried college and I absolutely loved it. It was the pillar of my educational experience. And I knew from this that I wanted to keep going. I knew that I wanted to try university. I loved college so much because it gives you that very hands-on experience. And a lot of people don't know that you can earn a bachelor's degree or an undergrad degree at an Ontario college, which I find is just, it's very accessible. And I find college for me personally has been a better learning experience than say in university, because I find it does add that little bit of hands-on learning that I personally need. So then I went on and did my undergrad degree. So I went to the University of Guelph from 2017 to 2020. And you'll see I have a general psychology degree. I do not have an honors degree. Because psychology is heavy math and science, my accommodations and the nature of my disability just did not line with this program. So needless to say, I wanted to get out of my undergrad as fast as possible. So one of my biggest advice for all of you who are, deciding where you want to go, college, university, what program, pick a program that is aligned with your learning needs, because I found psychology was just not it for me, and really struggled. So I decided that instead of pursuing a 4-year degree, I was going to pursue a 3-year degree and just finish with a general psych degree. Now, from there, I kind of took a year off to really discover what I wanted to do, because as a lot of you probably are feeling, is very overwhelmed, and I was as well. So even in this process, I didn't really know what I wanted to be still in my undergrad. So I took a year off to do some kind of exploration, figure out exactly what I love to do. And one thing that I loved about my university experience in particular was getting involved in campus life, being involved in student government. So I kind of used my resources, reached out to a bunch of people, asking how do I work at a university or a college and help students. And the president of the University of Guelph, who I was really close with at the time, was like, why not try student affairs? And I made a joke and was like, I don't even know what that is. What is this career field? So I looked into the Master of Education program at Wilfrid Laurier University, where I currently have 2 weeks left. So we're in the grind of it. And I discovered my love of university and college experience and supporting students who also have disabilities as well. And as you can see, I'm hoping to get into my doctoral program. So I noticed in this program that yes, I love student affairs, but something that I love even more is I love social justice, and I love to make policy changes for individuals in marginalized communities. As an Indigenous person and also someone who has a disability, I'm really passionate about uplifting people in these populations. So basically, I applied to my doctoral degree and I'm still waiting on a reply, but that's kind of the extent of my educational journey. So next slide. So with each area of my education, I've kind of developed tips that I personally have found helpful in this experience, because college and university, it is not as scary as a lot of people put it out there to be. It's actually a time where you learn a little bit more about yourself, and you grow in this identity that you never knew you had, and you get all of these experiences that are just, it makes it so incredible. And that's why I'm still working. I work at Mohawk College because I joke all the time that I do not want to leave college or university, because it's amazing. So kind of some tips and resources that I personally have found useful. The number one is practice study strategies and identify your learning style. So for me, I knew that I was a visual hands-on learner. Auditory, not even a single aspect of me is auditory whatsoever. So I knew that going into college and university that I would excel, having my presentation slides in advance, having any visual aids readily available, and also having examples. So I learned best by, if there was a certain theory that I study, I would actually kind of have like a map out of an example so I could put that into a tangible explanation of it in a more practical way for me. Another thing is take career quizzes, and don't be afraid if it says things that you're like, I don't know if I could be, because those are all things that will help you in this journey. I started off my post-secondary education thinking that I wanted to be a social worker for young offenders, and thinking because I love true crime. I later did a placement and figured out that that was just not the field for me. And one of the big things I want you all to kind of take away from this is post-secondary education is an ongoing process. It's not very linear as what society thinks it is. I know so many people who I support a lot of mature students with disabilities, and they're coming back for their second or their third round of a career. So know that you can change your mind eventually. You don't have to pick what you're going to do for the rest of your life. Now you can take a program, decide if you like it, and maybe change it. But one of the big things is there's a co-op option to take co-op, because co-op is kind of where I excelled in and where I really got that hands-on learning, where I was able to figure out exactly what I benefited from. Also, contact institutions and reach out to them in advance. If you're applying to Mohawk College or the University of Windsor, reach out to them and ask them about the services and how they support students with disabilities, just to get a little bit of an idea. Also, registered with Accessible Learning. I have found that going through my education, a lot of my accommodations really helped me to understand the material. And I don't think without having my advisor, I wouldn't know necessarily how to navigate this world of post-secondary education. So definitely having somebody from ALS be kind of in your corner for you. Also attend open houses. So get as much experience on campus as possible before you actually attend. So what I really like to do is, if I knew that I was applying somewhere, I would go to every single tour that they had. So I would go like once a week. Now you don't have to go once a week like me, but definitely at least going once, kind of get a feel of campus, get a feel of the faculty that you might be working with, and kind of the student affairs professionals that you could be utilizing the services from. I just found being on campus made me feel more part of the community. And if I felt that the institution was not aligned with myself, then I wouldn't apply there. But I found that really helped me kind of get ready for this transition into each phase of my education. Another thing is understanding your diagnosis and really understanding what your psychoeducational assessment is. Like, what is the terminology, kind of what does this mean for you, and kind of making a list of things that might be a barrier to you and things that make you a strength. So for me, I might lack in auditory processing, but where I thrive is I'm an excellent writer. So knowing what your strengths in your areas of need are, and knowing exactly what the nature of your disability is, and knowing kind of how it affects you and how to kind of overcome those barriers. And another thing is accommodations, and knowing exactly what your accommodations are, and highlight the ones that you definitely need. One of the big things that I found going through my education is that there were accommodations that I don't necessarily need. So one of the ones that I found in college that I didn't need is writing in a testing center, but I kept it anyways, just in case I needed it. And turns out that when I got to university, I needed to use the testing center a lot more frequently. So kind of knowing what your priority accommodations are and maybe your secondary accommodations are, knowing which ones that you might need to excel in your education and ones that, you're like, I could use these once in a while. Kind of like if you need an extension. For me, extensions, I don't typically need an extension, but in case I absolutely need it, I still have it on my accommodation letter. And one of the things that I always tell my students when I'm working with them, and also through my nonprofit as well, is advocacy is key. Knowing exactly what your needs are and how to advocate on your behalf. Because when you get into post-secondary education, it's no longer you have your parents to be able to advocate for you. So they definitely can still be involved in the process, but this is a time for you to flourish and to grow into the person you're meant to be. So knowing exactly what you need, being able to advocate for those needs, and genuinely just being able to discover who you are through this journey. And that's kind of the process of how I went into my education. So, but thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, I will delve into them after everybody else's presentation.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Cronwell.
Okay, next slide. So one of the nice things is you've been receiving typically accommodations and supports as you've gone through elementary and high school. And one of the nice things to know is that you are able to continue to receive accommodations and supports in your post-secondary studies and know that they're going to be available for you. What we know is that when you have those accommodations, you're going to be more able to participate in your studies, and you're going to have those equal opportunities to really demonstrate your knowledge and your skills. Next slide. So as I think Michaela was saying near the end of her presentation, one of the things I think is really important is that you understand is as you move from your high school into post-secondary studies, one of the biggest key changes that you're going to have to think about and be aware about is the increased responsibility that you're going to have to receive the accommodations and supports. So your ability to get those accommodation supports, which is going to increase your success. These becomes things that now you're going to be responsible. You're going to have to take a bigger role to ensure that you're receiving those accommodations and supports. So one of the biggest things in terms of high school and going into post-secondary is you will now have to identify yourself as a student who requires accommodations, and you'll have to start a process with what's called the Accessibility Services Office in many universities or colleges, but sometimes they have slightly different names. And it's going to then become very important for you to be the advocate to make sure that you're starting the process, you're going through the process, and you're being able to access those accommodations. And then that you're also, in this case, going to be the person who's going to be required to let your teachers or instructors or professors at the college or university know that you have accommodation. So often when you were in high school, your learning support teacher would often play that role for you. But now you're going to move into the idea that you have to do it. That's going to be one of the things that you have to take increased responsibility for. Next slide. So really the first step that you're going to have to go through is to set up an appointment with the Accessibility Services Office. And that first step is going to be to disclose your disability and then to get the accommodations and get that process started. And again, I think that this is really a major change because when you were in high school, what happened is you had most of you had an individual identification, placement, and review committee identification, and then everything from that IPRC was set up by the school staff. You received the accommodations because the school staff worked to set those up for you. So with the self-advocacy and participation, you will now have to start that process. So your role and your increased participation in the process is really one, and again, which Michaela talked about, is self-advocating for yourself. So this self-advocation becomes even more important. And as this role of self-advocation increases, right, that's going to increase your skills as you move forward as well. So it's going to force you to do that, but at the same point, you're going to find that over time, that's going to become something that you're going to turn into a strength, is your ability to self-advocate for yourself. So when we think about, going and having that first meeting and starting that process, many things that Michaela kind of talked about as well. It's really important to take some time to think about your strengths and your challenges in learning and what accommodation supports have been most helpful for you in the past. Remember that you are entitled to those accommodation supports, and what responsibilities you now have in the process at the secondary school increase. You often want to practice what it'll be like to attend your first meeting at the accessibility office. Do that with people you're comfortable. What are you going to say? How are you going to describe yourself? Also, it's always nice to try and get to the Accessibility Services Office as early as possible. And we often recommend that if you can do it before the school year starts, right? So typically, once you're accepted for university, that you could make your appointment, for example, sometime in the summer, go into the university and get that process started for you. The other thing that you need to know is it's better to do that than to have something happen and then try to go in a time of crisis. So do try to set that up as soon as possible. And again, throughout your entire schooling at a college or a university, don't hesitate to ever go into accessibility services and get the support. They are more than willing and happy to provide you that support. I think Michaela kind of certainly talked about that as well. Next slide. I won't go over this slide very much, but as you'll have the PowerPoint presentation. But again, I really want you to focus on that far right-hand column. And I think if you just kind of focus on that column, what you're going to see is that you do have that increased responsibility, and that you have to kind of, become more responsible and involved in that process, which I think can also be very, you can feel like you get a sense of control in that process as well. Sometimes maybe in elementary or high school, you didn't always feel that you had that control. I think one of the things of moving to colleges, university, when you're self-advocating and being in this process, you develop a larger amount of control as well. The other thing that you really have to think about as well is that you're going to have to let the people know in the university that you have the accommodations. So you're going to have to do that. And then just the last two parts of the far right corner. If you need an assessment, because typically the university or college is going to ask for an assessment that's, typically no more than 3 years old. If you don't have a current one, certainly there are ways to access that, often through, private health insurance if your parents have that, or through OSAP. And sometimes it is possible for us at the school board to do some assessments as well to assist students to get that assessment that they need prior. And the other thing is that the university and colleges, unlike our school board or the Catholic school board, don't provide you with a computer or a laptop. That's something that you have to take care of. However, there are some ways to access that as well that you can talk with them about when you're at the Disability Services Office. Next slide. Again, all the post-secondary schools, universities and colleges do have accessibility services offices. And again, they also can provide you with other supports and services. Michaela mentioned a number of those. So again, you want to work with them and make sure that you're getting the individual support and that all of your accommodations and other things that they can provide you are specific to your individual needs. Next slide. When we look at the accommodations that you're most likely to receive, this is not a number of them, but again, this is in all the possible accommodations or supports that you can receive. So certainly one of the ones is extended time on exams, no more than one exam per day, access to a computer or spell check on exams, especially if you write in the Accessibility Services Office. Often there can be some access to people who assist you in taking notes in class. For students who are blind, sign language, or their sign language interpreters. And again, Michaela also mentioned the idea of the ability to get extensions in assignments as well. So again, remember, all of those things are available. And it's one of the things we want to make sure that you are accessing to increase your success. Next slide. So again, because it's a little bit different from high school, when you have that first meeting with accessibility services, it's really important that you ensure that you bring all the documents with you that you need. So that psych assessment, previous IEPs that you've had, all of those things that will help them get a really good sense of what your learning strengths are and what your learning needs are. So that they can really then start to work with you to make sure that they're developing an individual accommodations program that best meets your need. Again, before you go to that meeting, do to try to take some time to look through your documentation so that you can really get a good sense of what your strengths are and also what your needs are. And I think that that's important. So again, speak to that information when you're in that first meeting with accessibility services. Next slide. So I want to leave with one other thing that can be really helpful. And then there's a part for students and there's a part for parents. So there's a program, and I've given you the links, that's called Eyes on PSE. And for students, there is a free online kind of prep course that helps you walk through what are the things that you're going to need to be successful, and how can they kind of get you ready to know what's coming and what to expect. The hope of the course is to really leave students, you as a student, really feeling, you know what, you're a little bit more prepared, you're a little bit more informed, and you're ready to go into post-secondary education. So the top link is for students. And if there are any parents on, there is also a parents version of Eyes on PSE. And that's something, again, that helps you as a parent understand the process and talks about some ways that you can help your child or student through that process.
Thanks, Dr. Cronwell. Nick Simonito.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you again, Marianne, for that lovely introduction. Just a quick recap. My name is Nick Simonito. I am the Vice President at the Board of Directors here at the Learning Disabilities Association of Windsor-Essex County. I'm also a developmental service worker with the local public school board. Full disclosure, I have a learning disability and went my entire academic journey receiving supports and accommodations through student services, including at the post-secondary level, both at St. Clair College and at the Basket University. During my time at post-secondary, I learned that probably one of the most important skill sets is to have self-advocacy. It gave me the strength and the confidence to ask for my accommodation. Sorry about that, to be successful. It is my hope that everybody takes something away from this presentation, including the confidence to speak up and ask for what you need. Next slide, please. So, why understanding your strengths and areas of needs is important. In order to be a better self-advocate, students need to do a little bit of self-exploration first. The questions below are a great example of how students can ask themselves these questions prior to self-advocating. So, first question they should ask is, what am I good at? What subjects do I find enjoyable? What sparks my interest? And furthermore, what I find difficult. What challenges do I experience during my learning? Do I struggle with reading lengthy textbooks or writing long essays? Third, we're going to talk about what supports and strategies help me to be successful. So do you utilize assistive technology, calculator to do math in your everyday learning? Next slide, please. So, strengths and areas of need. Strengths are characterized as areas that we tend to excel in. And oftentimes, individuals with learning disabilities can leverage their strengths to help them compensate for their areas of need or overcome barriers. Quick example, a student has difficulties with writing long essays, but is a strong oral communicator, can utilize voice-to-text software to dictate their words onto a computer screen, helping them to overcome this barrier. Areas of need can be identified as areas that we struggle with, and we might need some strategies, some tools, or accommodations to help us overcome these barriers. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to talk about the different learning styles, which Michaela had briefly touched on. Now, I've included the three major learning styles that we see most students identify with. This is not to say that there are multiple other learning styles that students may identify with, or that some students might feel they identify with different attributes from multiple learning styles. Rather, these are the three learning styles we see most students identify with. And the reason I include it is so that students can take the time to think about what learning style best suits them and some of the strategies and supports that can help improve or leverage their strengths when they do their learning. So a visual learner learns best through pictures, graphs, diagrams, films, and some strategies that visual learners utilize include flashcards with pictures and important details, highlighting textbooks, different color codes, creating graphs or charts of their own, and translating ideas or words into pictures, symbols, or graphs. Now, I was guilty of this when I went to school. I would rarely write long notes. I would always draw little pictures next to it to help me memorize and recall information at a later date. Next slide, please. So auditory learners. Auditory learners learn best when information is presented orally, for example, through presentations or verbal discussions. And some strategies audio learners utilize include working in groups or with study buddies to bounce ideas off of, when studying alone, walking and talking out loud to help them memorize the material, or utilizing a audio recording device or tape recorder. This is a common accommodation that we see in post-secondary institutions. Oftentimes students will take a recorder along with them and record the lectures or their notes so they can play them back at a different date. Next slide, please. Kinesthetic learners are basically learners that learn best through hands-on interaction. Some strategies that kinesthetic learners utilize include physical activity while studying. I've been known to do a few push-ups or walk back and forth while studying. Breaking down information into step-by-step routines and utilizing flashcards, or experimenting with different ways that they can make the learning more hands-on for themselves and understandable. All right, next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about why understanding your current IEP and accommodations is so important. So an IEP, as Dr. Crunwell had touched on earlier, has a lot of important information, from an overview of the student to assessments, accommodations, and even a transition plan in some cases. So a student will likely find that that IEP will follow them all the way from their elementary and high school journey. And many of the accommodations and supports can even follow them into the post-secondary realm. But it's important for students to keep in mind that in order for those accommodations to transfer over, they need to have the necessary documentation, such as a recent psychological assessment, or and be registered with their school's accessibility office to receive those accommodations. Next slide, please. So, making the most out of your IEP. Below are some questions that students should consider when reviewing their IEP. First off, do you feel that your strengths and areas of need are adequately addressed within your IEP? And do you feel that your IEP contains all of the accommodations you utilize in school on a daily basis? Michaela mentioned this earlier about accessing student services to write exams. Another example I could give you is if you, as a student, find you use a calculator every day for math and don't have it as an accommodation in your IEP or in your post-secondary institution, and then a instructor says, well, we're not going to use calculators for this exam or this assignment. Well, that might prove challenging for some students. I would strongly recommend that students take the time to review their IEP, especially each year, at the beginning of each year in high school and when they attend post-secondary. It would give the student better understanding of their accommodations and their strengths and their areas of need are. And oftentimes parents and educators can include the student in the IEP process by reviewing their IEP with them. Just a quick example, my final year of high school, I had the luxury of sitting in on an IEP meeting with my family, my principal, and my teachers. And I found it very empowering because I got to talk about my accommodations, my strengths, my areas of need, and what I was planning for my career and what school I was going to be attending in the fall. Next slide, please. So, becoming your best self-advocate. Here are some tips and tricks that we recommend. Don't be afraid or ashamed to ask for help. Oftentimes students are going to see their first year in college or university, everybody's asking for help, and students with learning disabilities should never feel ashamed to ask for the help they need. Recognizing that your voice has power. Dr. Crenwell touched on this a lot. When you go to college and university, it is an adult learning environment. And in the past, you might have had a parent or guardians doing a lot of the self-advocacy for you. But you are going to be the biggest advocate for yourself in college or university. Let others know your strengths and areas of need. Be confident when you talk to your instructors or professors, and approach your professors ahead of time. I can't stress this enough. Speak to your instructors ahead of time. Let them know that you're receiving supports and accommodations through student services and what they are and how they can assist you to be the best learner possible. Reach out to your school's accessibility office regularly and ahead of time, and be proactive. You might need to write your exams in student services. And if you wait till the last minute, you might not have a spot to write your exam. So you need to be proactive in your advocacy. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about accommodation versus modification. So accommodation gives the student the opportunity to have equal access to the course materials, information by removing barriers that inhibit the student's learning. Some examples we talked about were preferred seating, additional time for exams or assessments, or presenting information differently, orally or visually. A modification is directly changing the information that the student is learning from that of their peers in order to help them better understand the information. Some examples of a modification are reducing the amount of work, or learning different material at a different level, or altering the product. Student presents the information that they know. So when you get to college or university, they are required to accommodate you, not modify the course. So you're often going to see that they're not going to change your exams or your assignments. You're going to be required to complete the same examinations and same assignments. Rather, they're going to provide you the reasonable accommodations to make sure that you are successful. And really, accommodations provide no advantage to a student with learning disabilities. They really just even the playing field and make sure that everybody has access to the same information. Next slide, please. All right, and we're going to end off with your rights. Now, Dr. Crunwell touched on this a little earlier. The first piece of legislation I want to talk about is Article 21 of the United Nations Convention for Rights of Persons with Disabilities. States parties shall ensure the rights of persons with disabilities to education, with the view of realizing this right without discrimination or on the basis of equal opportunity. States parties shall ensure an inclusive education system at all levels lifelong. Next, we'll talk about AODA, or the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. Students with learning disabilities are entitled to equal treatment in post-secondary education, and reasonable accommodations must be provided to the point of undue hardship. I bring this up because I want students to keep in mind that these are your rights, and they are enshrined in provincial, federal, and international law. Students have every right to be accommodated and have access to their accommodations and supports. And you might find that this might bring you into some conflict with others, such as your peers or maybe even instructors who might not be providing you with all the necessary accommodations you're entitled to. And my suggestion is speak directly to the person that you're having a conflict with, be respectful and explain to them your accommodations, why you're receiving these supports, and that they're not providing you with any special treatment. Rather, they're giving you an even playing field so that you can be successful just like everyone else. And if this doesn't seem to remedy the situation, I would suggest going a step further, speaking to your accessibility office and making sure that your supports are set up and that you are receiving the accommodations you're entitled to. I want to thank everyone for attending, and back to you, Marianne.
Thanks, Nick. Anthony Gomez.
Hello, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about, in addition to all the excellent information that Michaela and Nick and Dr. Cronwell have shared, the means by which you can make a successful transition onto post-secondary, really focusing on the process itself. I've worked with students with a range of disabilities for a long while now, many students who walk the walk and gone on to be very successful. But it all starts with their making a good move from high school onto college or university. Next slide, please. So as a quick overview of what we'll be covering, I wanted to talk about how you can, as a pre-flight check before you arrive at the end of your high school education, the things you should prepare, the ways in which you can connect with your school of choice, and even to the point of choosing a school itself. And then once you've chosen your school and you've begun on their campus, ways you can get even more connected and to be aware of all the different support services within and without of the Accessibility Service Office at your school. Next slide, please. So it all begins before it begins. I've shared an excellent resource here, the Transition Resource Guide developed by the Regional Assessment and Resource Center at Queen's University. It's this great hub of information for students with an IEP and students that have already, that are on the cusp of finishing their high school education, that are considering, even the big question of what should I study and which schools should I attend. The Transition Resource Guide has a great directory of Ontario public colleges and universities, getting into the details of their specific accessibility services, and it links out from there onto those schools' accessibility office pages. In preparation for your transition, it's really important, and we've heard about this today already, to gather your most recent IEP. If you have an assessment report, an assessment that was conducted recently, to have that documentation in hand, and then looking online for other documentation that you might have. Looking ahead at various schools, accessibility offices. I know I can speak for the University of Windsor. We keep a repository of documentation forms that are public facing that students can access, take to their family doctor or medical specialist, and have completed and ready to go for when they do contact their schools or potential schools' accessibility offices. Next slide, please. Funding, I've got to say, in the 20 years since I was an undergrad student, college and university tuition in Ontario has continued to climb at a dramatic rate. So the funding question is a massive one. I encourage students to consider OSAP funding, to apply for various bursaries and scholarships as they may be available. The disabilityawards.ca webpage here, maintained by the National Education Association of Disabled Students, or NEEDS, is a current and thorough repository of bursaries and scholarships that are available across the country to students that have an IEP or have a disability diagnosis. Speaking with our own financial aid office on campus, we hear every year that there's hundreds of thousands of dollars in bursary funding and scholarships that go unclaimed because students never really look into applying. So at the outset, I tell any student I talk to, have you looked into this? Have you applied for OSAP funding? Have you talked to your school about bursaries and scholarships? There are disability-specific bursaries that I help students to access and help complete applications for. These are really important things to consider. And then while you're a student, work. Again, I remember at the beginning of my career at Windsor, we were supposed to tell students that until they got to maybe third year or fourth year, not to even consider keeping a part-time job while they were completing their studies, while they were in their courses. School had to be their number one focus. But a good long while ago, I stopped giving that advice or that recommendation simply because, again, life has gotten to be a lot more expensive than it was 20 years ago. So tuition's up, rent, food, fuel, all of it. So I fully expect that students will have to balance at least a part-time employment along with 4 or 5 part-time or full-time courses. This is a lot of the growth that we heard Michaela and Nick talk about. A lot of the growth and a lot of the preparation you'll have to do just to manage both those competing demands on your time. Next slide, please. So just about every school in Ontario, my school, I mean college or university, has something in the way of a general orientation day or series of days that they run. At Windsor, it's called our Head Start Days. I'm sure St. Clair runs an equivalent, and then every school from this way up to 401 does as well. So once you've done your research, you've shortlisted your schools close to Windsor or far away, it's important to then look up, when you've applied for those schools, to look up your that school's orientation days. These, again, are not specific for students with disabilities, but in general, just to go and sort of kick the tires and see how the campus feels for you, to talk to staff there, to get in touch with that school's accessibility office, look at their website. I know in the summer, even before the summer starts, it's very common for us to meet with prospective students, incoming students that are planning or they're considering Windsor, and they'll be upfront. They'll get in touch with our office. They'll want to talk about how accommodation works in post-secondary, that critical split that Nick mentioned between accommodation versus modification. That's a big one. So this key time sort of in summer for those orientation days, that's a great chance to have these questions answered. Next slide, please. In addition to the general orientation days I mentioned, the vast majority of Ontario schools conduct transition programs that are specifically for students that are coming in with learning disability diagnosis, ADHD diagnosis, or otherwise. This is a shameless plug for our Bill program at Windsor, but again, there's mirrors to this program all throughout Ontario, and oftentimes they're free. Ours is, and so once you've shortlisted your school and you applied to your school, at that point or just shortly after that point, when you've been offered admission, is to then look into that school's transition program. The programs will cover everything from how accommodations work, what works for lectures versus exam situations, flexible timelines and deadlines. They'll talk about documentation, and it's very much a process. So the same way the process of applying for picking your classes, enrolling in your classes, term after term is very standard. These systems are also very standard as well. So it's really important to sort of make the best start to your degree or your diploma. It's a massive outlay of time and funds. So I think to really get the most back for your investment in both those things, it's really critical that you do everything you can to start off correctly. On to the next slide, please. And then once you've connected with your school, the accessibility office, like I know, again, speaking from my experience at Windsor, is just one tiny piece of the puzzle. Every Ontario college and university will have its own on-campus or in-house health services department. I know we have a pharmacy on campus. Most schools have those as well. They'll have a general academic advising office that helps with, picking your courses for next semester, getting a sense of how you're doing academically, what you need to focus on, how you can prepare for upcoming exams, writing support areas, departments, offices. One of the big changes for students starting off, moving from high school to university, is the level of independent work, the level of research they've got to do, the amount of writing at a university or college level, where citation is everything, and correctly citing your work and your words that you're referencing in your papers. It's a whole different way of approaching writing that you may not have been exposed to before. And then every school will have a student success office, again, apart from accessibility services. And all they do is work with students to help them, keep their grades up, stay healthy, stay balanced. And so these are resources that would not cost you a penny as far as being a student at that school. And so we encourage students to just go out and connect with them. This is part of what you're paying for, really, in your tuition. So you should use all the resources at your fingertips. And then lastly, we saw this a change or the growth of during online learning during COVID. A lot of online networks and clubs, Discord servers that have sprung up. And any school you attend in Ontario will have some version of those. And these are non-academic groups. If you're attending a school that's out of town, you might not know anyone on your campus at first. That the importance of getting connected, I can't overstate. Just rebuilding what I call your invisible support networks that exist for you right now. as a student in high school between family and friends, replicating those in your new home, perhaps hours away, and even on your new campus here in Windsor. And last slide, please. So don't forget, I think all of my fellow presenters today have mentioned a version of this, but you really have to be an active participant in this process. Picking your courses, connecting with your faculty members, jumping in with both feet when it comes to keeping up with your work and studying. All that weight can be a bit daunting to have that on your shoulders, but that's how the system works. And it's part of your journey to becoming a better self-advocate and really to growing as a person and becoming your next self. And lastly, I'd say it's important to be open to that push and pull between having a plan and then adjusting your plan as you try it out, and some things work and some things don't. Trying to forge ahead with a plan that you're realizing isn't sort of the right fit for you or isn't working. It's really important to be able to reevaluate and change on the fly so that you end up in a good place. And that's all I had. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Anthony. So the Learning Disabilities Association, we have developed a transition to post-secondary checklist that you will each receive a copy once we send a link to the video and a copy of the slides. It it has a checklist about the educational supports that you need to consider, financial and funding options, and then finally transition activities. So we will send you a copy of that. Next slide. So we're at the question and answer period. We ask that you place your questions in the chat box, and then we'll put it out to the panelists, each question, and they can take turns on answering those questions for you.
Okay, so we do have one question to start off with. If my child has had a developmental assessment and been diagnosed with an auditory processing disorder from childhood and had IEPs all along, will they need another physiological/auditory processing assessment prior to attending college or university?
So we'll just ask someone from the panel that wants to take this question on.
From my perspective, I believe the answer is yes, but Anthony may be able to answer that for us more clearly.
Sure, I'll jump in. I can say that when it comes to documentation, disability documentation, the more current, the better. And specifically around auditory processing, it can present interestingly where if your son or daughter was impacted by it during those critical years when language acquisition was happening and they were learning sort of the building blocks of reading and writing and speech, then that can manifest sometimes later on as almost like a language-based learning disability. So I think I'll advise students that are about to make their transition to post-secondary to gather up all their documentation. In the event of an auditory processing disorder, if they have a more recent processing auditory evaluation, that certainly helps. But if not, when they begin at their university or college of choice, as has been said today, you can connect with that school's accessibility office, and then your advisor at that office can help refer you for new documentation if what you have is out of date.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be any other questions, but do feel free if something pops up later on after this webinar, feel free to email us or give us a call, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So next slide. We do have a survey that we're asking you to complete, and we will put it here in the chat, the link. If you can take a minute to access that and give us your feedback so that going forward as we create these webinars, we have some feedback on how to do that. We do still have one more quick speaker that will talk about our upcoming free transition to post-secondary workshop for students.
Thanks, Marianne. Hi, I'm Tammy Wilcox. I'm the president, the board president for the Learning Disabilities Association of Windsor, Essex. And I just want to thank our outstanding panelists for participating in today's webinar. I would also like to thank our hardworking education committee and staff for organizing this webinar. We will be offering a one-day transition to post-secondary workshop for students in grades 11 and 12 for those transitioning to post-secondary. This free one-day workshop will be held in person on Saturday, May 13th. And following this webinar, you will receive an email with a copy of the transition workshop, today's presentation, and the transition to post-secondary checklist. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all once again for joining us this evening and thank everyone for a job well done. Thank you.
Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our email is there as well as our phone. We did just launch a new website this week, thanks to the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and all of our information about programs as well as resources for transitioning can be found on that website. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Again, on behalf of myself and the staff, I do thank our wonderful panelists and all of you for joining us today. As Tammy mentioned, we will be sending out a link for the recorded webinar, as well as the slide deck and the tip sheet, the checklist sheet, as well as information on how to register for the free one-day workshop for students in grades 11 and 12. Thank you again and take care.